And now we should be able to connect remotely via remote desktop. And there you have it. So we've resolved that a little bit of issue there. All right, let's go to the Start menu, and we'll open up the Forefront UAG Management Console. And the first thing we want to do is create an HTTPS trunk. So we'll select this link here, and it's going to launch the trunk creation wizard, and it's going to ask us some information. We'll supply that, and we'll get our trunk up and running in no time. So let's click Next. It's going to ask us what kind of trunk we want to use. This is going to be a portal trunk. We're not going to publish Exchange applications via the portal, at least right now. We're going to do that later. So we're going to go ahead and leave that option there. So we'll choose Next. The trunk name is the friendly name. This can be whatever you want, so I'm just simply going to call it portal. And then the public host name is actually the fully qualified domain name of the trunk itself. So this is the name that needs to be registered in public DNS, so I'm going to call this portal.vintagesurf.com. It's going to select a IP address, one of the public IPv4 addresses that is assigned to the external network interface of the UAG server. So if I have multiple IP addresses here, I could select that. But in this case, the only IP address that I have assigned to that interface is here. And I'll accept the default ports and choose Next. Now it's going to ask me about authentication and where my authentication servers are. I haven't created any yet, so I'll go ahead and select Add. And then I'll select Add again. And the first directory server type that shows up is Microsoft's Active Directory. Now here's where you see, if you click down on this drop-down menu, you'll see you have a number of different choices that you can use. My favorite here is Other. Basically this means that you can write code to actually connect to just about any authentication repository your mind could imagine. So you can pretty much authenticate against anything and everything, but this is an essentials course. We're sticking to the basics, so we're going to choose Active Directory. The server name is not the host name of the server. This is the server name as it will appear in the drop-down menu for your authentication repository. So I'm just going to simply call this Active Directory. And then we'll go to the connection settings, and there's two choices here. The default is to define individual domain controllers. If I select the Define button, I can actually place or choose the IP address of the domain controllers, IP addresses or fully qualified domain names or single label host names for the domain controllers, and optionally I can connect using SSL and TLS. This is helpful and very handy if the UAG server is not a member of the domain and I need to connect to Microsoft domain controllers or LDAP controllers with Active Directory, and I would specify that information here. But I'm not going to do that. I'm a member of the domain, so I'm going to select Use Local Active Directory for authentication. So this is basically going to rely on the operating system to locate the appropriate domain controller and connect to it and use that one for authentication. So next we're going to choose our base DN for our search settings. So anytime we are searching for users and groups, we will do so using this base DN. By default, it selects the base DN of the user's container, and that's fine for our environment, but if you need to modify this, so if your users are not in the user's OU, if they're in another container, then you certainly can provide that information here. But we're sticking with the defaults. We're going to stick with our users group, so that's fine. If you have organization units below the container that you've specified as the base DN, you would actually select to include subfolders. In addition, if you are using nested groups, you will have to supply the level for which you would want to continue to look for groups. By default, it is 0. It will not look for nested groups, but if you do have nested groups, you can select the level to which you would want to search those groups. It's a good idea not to leave this setting blank, as this can cause issues in environments with very large active directories. Leaving it blank can potentially result in delayed or even failed logins. And then last thing we're going to ask for is access to the server. So this is supplying the credentials for an account that has access to read your directory. Here I've created a service account called AD Service, and I'll provide the password for that, and then we will choose OK. So now that we've created our directory, we can choose Select, and you'll see that it shows up in the list. Now, there's an option here, and this is select by default, and this is users select this from the list. So if you have multiple authentication repositories, you can allow the end user to select which authentication server or authentication repository to choose when they log in. And in this case, we'll select that option, and we'll leave all the defaults, and we will move on. So we'll choose Next. In a previous lesson, I demonstrated how to properly install an SSL certificate in the local computer certificate store. However, in this lesson, I want to demonstrate a slightly different way to install this certificate, so I have, for the purposes of this demonstration, deleted the previously imported certificate. Now, you'll see that the only certificate shown here is the default self-signed certificate. So, to import a certificate, select the option to launch the certificate manager. I really like this feature because it takes me to the correct computer certificate store, that being the local computer's certificate store. So I'll expand personal and certificates, and then here you'll see we have a couple of certificates, but we need to import our existing SSL, public SSL certificate. So I'm just going to choose right-click and choose All Tasks, and then select Import, and then we'll choose Next. I will browse for the file name, and this is on the desktop, and also since this is a certificate with a private key, it is a PFX, so we'll need to select that from the list, and it's in the certificates folder. There it is, and we'll choose Open, select Next, and supply the password for the file that contains the private key. There's an option here that says to mark this key as exportable. From a security perspective, this is not necessarily a good idea or a best practice. It means that any other administrator could come along and then export the private key. So we want to keep a good handle on our private keys, so we don't want to do that, but ultimately that's your decision. So we'll choose Next. Place the certificates in the following store, and that's the personal certificate store, so that's perfect. So choose Next and Finish. The import was indeed successful. Now you'll see I have my wildcard certificate here, and let's double click on that certificate and check a couple of things. So of vital importance, of course, is that the issued to name, or the subject name, matches our public host name. So vintagesurf.com has this certificate issued to it, and this is a wildcard certificate, so it covers everything. If this was a standard certificate with just a single subject name, then that name would have to match my portal. Again, portal.vintagesurf.com would have to be here. Another important thing, of course, is to make sure that the certificate is indeed valid. Obviously, expired certificates are not going to work for us, so make sure that the certificate is valid, and make certain that you have the private key that corresponds to this certificate. This is not going to work for us if we don't have the private key, so that is absolutely essential. Next, go to the certification path. We want to make sure that this certificate is fully trusted all the way to the root. So it is indeed, so the certificate is OK. So we'll choose OK, and we can close out this console. Now we'll go back and select the certificate, and you'll see that our wildcard certificate indeed shows up. So we'll choose Next. And then for endpoint security, we're going to select the default option to use Forefront UAG access policies. This is the most common deployment of UAG, is to use the UAG policies. It does support NAP integration, but that's not something we'll be covering in this Essentials course. So we'll choose Next. And then endpoint policies. This is again something we'll cover in a later lesson. So we're going to accept the defaults, and we'll come back to this in a later lesson when we talk specifically about endpoint policies. So we'll choose Next and review our configuration, and then choose Finished. Once we have made those changes, we can now save the configuration. And of course, if you remember from an earlier lesson, once it's been saved, it really doesn't do anything until it is indeed activated. So let's select the Activate Configuration button. So we'll select the option to back up the configuration before performing the activation. That's great. So we'll choose Activate. Once the activation has completed successfully, go ahead and choose Finish. As I'd mentioned before, it's a good idea to go to the Messages tab and select Filters Messages, and check the option to include informational messages. So choose that, do that, and choose OK. And now what you'll see is that it says that the status is waiting for TMG to synchronize. So these changes haven't been fully applied until such time as TMG has been fully synchronized. So we'll wait for that to happen before we go to our client and start testing. So activation has been completed successfully. So we can go ahead and close out of the management console. And now we can actually go over to our client and test and make sure that the portal is functioning correctly from the outside. So let's go over to our client. And the first thing we need to do on this client, since this is in a virtual environment, is actually move the client to the public internet, because right now it's on my private local network. So I'm going to go disable a network adapter that's connected to my private network. And I'm going to go ahead and enable the public network. So basically I've taken my workstation and I've now simulated being at home on my home internet connection, or a coffee shop, or in a hotel, or something like that. So I'm on the public internet, and once the network connectivity status indicator indicates that I have access to the internet, I will go ahead and browse the portal for the first time. So I'll enter in the URL, portal.vintagesurf.com. And you'll see that the application and network access portal starts to load, and it prompts me to install these components. These are the endpoint components that are vital and essential to some of the functionality that Forefront UAG provides. The UAG client components provide for the facility to query the endpoint and interrogate the endpoint to determine configuration and health status. It also allows us to establish our SSL network tunneling, which we'll talk about in a later lesson. So we'll choose Install. And then, of course, for full functionality, we do have to exclude this from our pop-up restrictions, so I'll go ahead and choose Yes. And the site also needs to be added to the trusted sites list in Internet Explorer. So I'm going to go ahead and choose Always, and then select to trust that site. So once we've installed the endpoint components successfully, we should be able to log in using my Active Directory username and password. And I've logged into the portal successfully. I don't have any applications defined yet. We're going to get to that in a later lesson, but the application and network access portal is functioning. All of my name resolution, public name resolution certificates are working correctly, so that's great. So I'm going to go ahead and log out, and then I want to make one more change to Forefront UAG. So we're back at the management console for Forefront UAG, and now I want to select the option to use an HTTP trunk. Now, I'm going to create a very specific type of HTTP trunk, and that's basically a redirect trunk. So I'll demonstrate that here shortly. So we'll choose Next. I'm going to select HTTP to HTTPS redirection. This is going to make it easier for our users to access the portal when they're typing the URLs into their browser. They won't have to use HTTPS. They'll just type in the name, get redirected automatically to the HTTPS site. So we'll choose Next, and we'll select our portal trunk to redirect that to Next, and then Finish. And once again, we will save the configuration and activate it. So once the activation is completed successfully, I'll choose Finish. And I will wait for TMG storage to synchronize. And once that activation has been completed successfully, I can go back over to my client and we can test the redirect trunk. So I'm going to open my web browser again, but this time I'm not going to enter in the protocol. I'm just simply going to type portal.vintagesurf.com. You'll notice that it was automatically redirected to HTTPS portal.vintagesurf.com. So again, this makes it easier for our users to access the portal. We can just simply tell somebody, go to portal.vintagesurf.com. They don't have to type in HTTPS every time, and they're good to go. So that brings us to the end of this lesson. Thanks so much for watching.